Chapter 141. Valeria Olarian, 5. I made a mistake. He was indeed the person who had dealt with that bandit leader. Valeria exhaled deeply, her sword lowering just a fraction as she took a moment to gather her breath. The intensity of the battle had worn at her resolve, but there was no denying it now. This man, Lucavian, was every bit the warrior people claimed him to be. Her violet eyes softened, and she let out a quiet sigh as she glanced at his face. I misjudged you, she admitted, her voice calmer now, no longer filled with the cold edge of earlier. I apologize for my rudeness, for doubting your strength. I was in a bad mood and I took it out on you. Lucavian's expression softened, the predatory gleam in his eyes fading as he relaxed his stance. He gave her a small, almost amused smile. Don't worry about it. I don't mind. Valeria's lips twitched into a faint smile of her own. That's good to hear, she said, the tension in her body easing. But then her grip tightened around her sword once more, and a spark of excitement lit up her eyes. But even so, I can't stop now. Lucavian raised an eyebrow, his smile widening slightly in response to the shift in her tone. How could I? Valeria continued, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. After finding an opponent like you, how could I stop before seeing this duel through to the end? Lucavian chuckled softly at her words, his posture shifting as he took a step back. The black starlight that had coiled around his estoc began to dissipate, the aura of mana retreating. His eyes met Valeria's, and with a subtle nod, he seemed to signal something, an unspoken understanding that passed between them. Valeria immediately understood. She mirrored his actions, pulling back her own mana until the only thing left between them was the weight of their swords and their skill alone. Lucavian's smile deepened, and he raised his blade in a casual salute. Speaking with blades, isn't that how it's done? Valeria's smile widened, a gleam of excitement in her eyes. Yes, she replied, her voice filled with anticipation. That's exactly how it's done. With their mana withdrawn, the duel was no longer about raw power or magical enhancement. Now it was purely about skill, precision, and the art of the sword. The clash of steel rang out through the clearing, the sound sharp and resonant as Valeria's Zweihander met Lucavian's estoc with perfect precision. Valeria's strikes were steady, deliberate, and flawless, each movement a testament to years of rigorous training and unyielding discipline. Her family's swordsmanship was deeply ingrained in her, a style that emphasized simplicity over flourish, but every strike carried the weight of her expertise. The Olarian family's sword style was built on the principle of perfecting the basics. There was no need for complex, intricate maneuvers or fancy techniques. Valeria's father had drilled it into her since she was a child. The most powerful swordsmanship came from mastering the fundamentals and executing them flawlessly. And she had done just that. Valeria's muscles coiled, her Zweihander held steady as she lunged forward with a wide, sweeping strike aimed at Lucavian's left flank. The weight of her sword pulled with power, forcing her to rely on her core strength to maintain balance. He's fast. Lucavian's estoc flashed like a streak of silver, meeting her blade at a sharp angle just before the impact. The lightness of his weapon seemed no match for her Zweihander, but the way he deflected the strike, his blade angled just enough to guide the force away without absorbing it, was flawless. He's not blocking. He's guiding my strikes away. Valeria's thoughts raced as she adjusted her stance, her next move flowing instinctively. She twisted her wrists, bringing the blade down again with a high, arcing strike aimed at his shoulder. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, perfect the basics. Don't overcomplicate it. But Lucavian was already in motion. His feet barely touched the ground as he sidestepped the blow, his estoc moving with him in a sweeping curve that came dangerously close to her exposed side. Valeria pivoted on her heel, pulling back just in time to avoid the thrust. The air seemed to hum with the closeness of the near miss, and her heart pounded against her ribcage. He's not just deflecting. He's positioning himself for the kill. There was no bloodthirst in his expression, no raw killing intent radiating from him, yet Valeria could see it in the way his blade moved, in the sharp precision of every strike. His movements were controlled, deliberate, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Each time she attacked, he reacted not to overpower her but to let her expose herself, ready to end the duel with one decisive blow. He's using my own strength against me. She swung again, a diagonal cut from above, aiming for his collarbone. Lucavian's estoc darted up, the tip meeting her blade at a shallow angle, sliding off effortlessly. He stepped inside her guard, his sword's tip grazing past her forearm, a ghost of a touch, reminding her how easily he could have drawn blood. Valeria's eyes widened, but she didn't hesitate. She rotated her grip, the Zweihander sweeping low this time, aimed at his legs, trying to trip him. But Lucavian danced away, light on his feet, his estoc sweeping in a graceful arc that redirected her blade upward. How is he reading me so well? Each time their swords met, it was as if he saw her intent before she even moved. Her powerful strikes, meant to overwhelm, were effortlessly deflected. There was no room for mistakes, and yet, she felt a thrill coursing through her veins. He's not using his full strength. He's playing with me. Her grip tightened, sweat beading along her brow as she shifted her stance again, her mind working to find a gap in his defenses. But Lucavian moved like a shadow, his estoc always just out of reach, always angled perfectly to parry or deflect her strikes. His movements had a deadly elegance, like his blade existed for no other purpose than to kill. It's not bloodlust, it's something else. He doesn't just fight, he kills with every strike. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, but it also ignited something inside her. A fire, a desire to push herself further. Her strikes came faster now, less measured, more desperate. She aimed at his chest, then his thigh, then his shoulder, trying to break through his impeccable defense. But Lucavian didn't falter. His blade danced around hers, the tip of his estoc flashing like lightning as it intercepted her every move. And then, without warning, he struck. The angle was sharp. He sidestepped her downward strike, his estoc slipping through the gap in her defenses, aimed directly for her throat. Valeria's breath caught as she twisted her body at the last second, the blade grazing her skin, close enough to feel the cold steel, but not deep enough to draw blood. That would have been the end. For a heartbeat, everything stilled. Valeria's violet eyes locked with his, and for the first time, she saw it clearly, the precise intent behind his every movement. His blade wasn't just a weapon. It was an extension of his will, designed to kill with efficiency and grace. I've fought warriors before, but never someone like him. Lucavian's expression remained calm, though there was something in his eyes now, a flicker of acknowledgement. He wasn't taking her lightly, but there was a part of him that held back, as if he was testing her limits rather than seeking to end the duel outright. I can't win like this. I need to change the pace. Valeria exhaled, her chest rising and falling as she caught her breath. She reset her stance, her sword held lower now, closer to her body. Her mind raced with new tactics, but there was no time to dwell on them. Lucavian advanced, his estoc gleaming in the light. He came at her with a thrust, low and fast, aiming for her side. Valeria twisted her body, narrowly avoiding the strike, but before she could recover, his blade came again. A quick slash aimed at her wrist. She brought her Zweihander up in time, but the force of his strike knocked her back a step. Lucavian pressed forward, his strikes relentless but precise, each one aimed with deadly intent. His estoc flicked out at angles that left her scrambling to keep up. A thrust aimed at her ribs, a cut aimed at her knee, each strike a calculated blow meant to disable or kill. He's too fast. But even as she thought that, something within her ignited. A stubborn resolve took root. She wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to let him overwhelm her. Valeria's breath came quicker as she parried another strike, her arms burning with the effort. She swung wide, forcing him to step back, and in that split second, she saw it, the opening. She didn't hesitate. Valeria surged forward, her Zweihander coming down in a powerful overhead strike. Lucavian's estoc rose to meet it, the clash of steel ringing out through the clearing. For a moment, their blades locked, both of them pushing against each other, testing their strength. Valeria's eyes narrowed, her grip tightening on the hilt of her sword as she pushed with all her might. But Lucavian's expression remained calm, his body unyielding. And then, with a sudden, graceful movement, he disengaged, his estoc slipping free and arcing around in a swift, deadly strike aimed at her exposed side. Valeria barely had time to react. She twisted her body, her Zweihander coming up just in time to block the blow, but the force of it sent her stumbling back. He's incredible, and that stumble back ended the fight, as the long blade of estoc reached her neck. Schlink. It is over. Chapter 142. Valeria Olarian, 6. Valeria froze as the cold edge of Lucavian's estoc hovered just inches from her neck. The sharp steel glinted in the fading light, its presence undeniable. Neither of them was out of breath. They hadn't used mana, and both had fought with the precision of seasoned warriors. Yet, despite her skill and her best efforts, it was clear she had lost. The chill of the blade lingered against her skin, a reminder of her defeat. She swallowed hard, her pride stinging as Lucavian's calm expression remained unchanged. With a measured motion, he withdrew his estoc, the blade sliding back into its sheath with a soft click. His smile deepened, but there was no smugness in it, only that same, unsettling calm. Valeria, her face flushed with a mixture of frustration and acknowledgement, straightened. "It's over," she murmured, her voice tinged with reluctant acceptance. She knew she had been bested. Her blade may have been flawless in technique, but it had not been enough. Lucavian offered no immediate response as he took a step back. His posture relaxed, though his smile hadn't faltered. Valeria's irritation bubbled up, her lips pressing into a thin line. The way he smiled, it grated on her nerves, even though she knew she had no one to blame but herself. She couldn't help it. "What are you smiling about?" she demanded, her tone sharper than intended. Her pride had already taken a blow, and the fact that he seemed so amused only made it worse. "What's so funny?" Lucavian's smile softened, but his gaze remained steady as he met her eyes. "Nothing in particular," he replied with an easy shrug. "I just enjoy a good duel, that's all." Valeria narrowed her eyes at him, still feeling the sting of her defeat. The way he said it, so casually, made it sound as if the duel had been nothing more than a passing amusement for him. It infuriated her, even though she knew deep down that her own misjudgment had led to this outcome. "Oh, really?" she said while glaring at him. "Yep," he said with a smile. "Now, did our duel satisfy you?" Valeria's glare lingered for a moment longer, her pride warring with the undeniable reality of what had just transpired. She hated admitting it, but the truth was plain. She had been outmaneuvered at every turn. No matter how hard she pushed, Lucavian had met her with perfect precision, his every movement calculated to dismantle her attacks before she even had a chance to land them. Her lips tightened into a thin line, and despite her irritation, she slowly nodded her head. "Yes," she muttered, her voice laced with reluctant acceptance. It did. The memory of how easily he had deflected her strikes gnawed at her. She had been so sure of her technique, so confident in her ability to overwhelm him with the weight of her family's swordsmanship. But Lucavian had moved with a deadly grace she had rarely seen before. There was no flourish in his style, no wasted movement, just pure, lethal efficiency. As much as she hated to admit it, this man was talented with the sword. And even now, after the duel, she couldn't see a way she would win against him. Not in a pure sword fight, and certainly not if they fought with their full power. That black starlight mana of his, it was too strong, too otherworldly. It pulsed with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine just thinking about it. But beyond his strength, there was something else that bothered her. The way Lucavian fought, it wasn't just about skill or talent. His style, while graceful, carried a deadly intent that set him apart from the typical knights or warriors she had faced. His every swing was precise, sure, and above all, designed to kill. There was no hesitation, no holding back. He didn't fight for honor, glory, or even victory. He fought to end lives. It was that realization that gnawed at her, refusing to leave her mind. Who was this man, really? She straightened slightly, her violet eyes studying him carefully. Just who are you, really? She asked, her voice quieter now but filled with curiosity. The way you fight. It's not like any knight I've ever seen. You don't fight for sport. You fight to kill. Lucavian's smile remained, but the faint shadow in his eyes hinted at something deeper, something he wasn't willing to share. Valeria's curiosity lingered, gnawing at her as she waited for him to elaborate. But instead, he took the conversation in a different direction, deflecting with a nonchalant shrug. Well, he said, the lightness returning to his voice, I'm just a commoner, after all. A commoner, huh? Valeria raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. There was no way someone with his level of skill, with that black starlight aura, was just an ordinary commoner. Lucavian chuckled softly, sensing her doubt. That's right. Nothing more, nothing less. His tone was light, teasing, as if he enjoyed keeping her in the dark. Before Valeria could press further, Lucavian tilted his head, his gaze flicking to her sword, then back to her stance. His eyes held a knowing glint, as if he had been reading her the entire time. But you, he said, his voice slipping into a playful, yet insightful tone, every move you make. It's rigid but powerful, like it's been drilled into you thousands of times. There's precision, strength, but also a bit of restraint. Just like a noble should be. Valeria's eyes widened slightly at his words. It wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it, with that infuriating smile still playing on his lips, as if he had deciphered her entire fighting style in mere moments. And the worst part? He wasn't wrong. He took a step closer, his gaze dancing with amusement as he continued. You fight with the discipline of someone born into it. Every swing of your sword, every step you take. It's practiced, honed, perfect on the surface. But, he paused, his smile widening, it's also a bit predictable, don't you think? Valeria bristled at the comment, her pride stinging. Predictable? She echoed, her tone sharpening. You're calling me predictable? Lucavian raised a hand, as if to calm the sudden edge in her voice. Now, don't get me wrong, he said with a grin. It's not a bad thing. You're strong. Very strong, actually. But, he leaned in slightly, his eyes twinkling with that teasing light. There's a difference between fighting to showcase something and a real fight. Valeria's eyes narrowed, her temper rising. Enlighten me then, she said, her voice tinged with irritation. She crossed her arms, her posture rigid as she glared at Lucavian. What exactly makes the difference between fighting to showcase and a real fight? Lucavian's grin didn't waver. In fact, it only widened, as though he had been expecting her challenge. He leaned back slightly, his eyes still twinkling with that same teasing amusement. Well, for one, he began casually, you've never been in a life-and-death duel, have you? Valeria's brows shot up at the remark, her pride flaring up again. Of course I have, she replied sharply. I'm a knight. I've fought in real battles. Life and death was part of the job. Lucavian chuckled softly, his expression unbothered by her irritation. Really? He asked, his tone light, but there was an underlying note of challenge. Because it didn't feel like it. The way he said it, the casual dismissal of her experiences, made Valeria's blood boil. Her grip tightened around the hilt of her sword as she took a step forward, her violet eyes flashing with anger. You're saying I don't know what a real fight is? She demanded. Lucavian's grin remained, completely unfazed by her growing frustration. I'm just saying, he replied with a shrug, if you've really been in a life-and-death duel, you wouldn't fight the way you do. There's something different about how someone moves when everything's on the line. Valeria's teeth clenched as his words sank in. The teasing, the casual dismissal of her skills, it was infuriating. She felt a fire building inside her, a need to prove herself. Without thinking, she stepped forward, her hand gripping her sword tighter. Let's go again. Then, she said, her voice heated. I'll show you what a real fight is. But before she could draw her blade, Lucavian raised a hand, stopping her in her tracks. Sorry, he said, his tone light but firm. That service is no longer available. Valeria blinked, caught off guard by his response. What? She asked, her anger momentarily stalled by confusion. Lucavian chuckled again, shaking his head. We already had our duel, he said, casually tapping the hilt of his estoc. Besides, I think I've had enough for one day. Valeria scowled, her frustration bubbling to the surface again. You're just saying that because you're afraid I'll beat you this time. Lucavian's grin returned, more amused than ever. Maybe, he said with a playful wink. But I like to think I'm just being considerate. Wouldn't want to bruise your pride twice in one day. Valeria's face flushed with anger, but before she could retort, Lucavian turned on his heel and started walking away, leaving her standing there with her fists clenched, a mix of anger and reluctant respect swirling inside her. Bastard. I am going to beat you next time. The humiliation she had suffered. She was not going to forget that. Chapter 143. Annoying. As I walked away, leaving Valeria standing there with her fists clenched and frustration boiling beneath her composed exterior, I couldn't help but feel a sense of amusement settle over me. I knew I'd gotten under her skin, and frankly, it had been more fun than I expected. I could already feel Vitaliera stirring on my shoulder, the familiar warmth of her presence returning after she had remained silent during the duel. That girl, she began, her voice cutting into my thoughts, laced with irritation. She's insufferable, arrogant, uptight, and way too proud for her own good. I chuckled softly to myself as I continued walking, listening to her rant. Vitaliera had always had a sharp eye for people, and her assessment of Valeria was unsurprisingly blunt. Did you see the way she carried herself? The whole world should bend to her because she's from a noble family. Ugh, people like that make me sick. And don't even get me started on the way she talked to you. Like she expected you to bow at her feet the moment she drew her sword. She wasn't that bad, I said, smiling to myself. Just a bit rigid. Rigid. Vitaliera scoffed, her tail flicking in annoyance. She was practically made of stone. The way she talks, the way she fights. It's like she's never been questioned a day in her life. And that superiority complex of hers? Don't even get me started. I don't think that is a superiority complex, I thought. Remembering what kind of person she was from the novel, I can see why Vitaliera thinks Valeria has a superiority complex. There have been many times when even Alara thought the same thing. It was easy to see why someone would think that, especially with how Valeria carried herself, so rigid, so certain of her own position and the hierarchy that defined her world. It's not because she feels superior, I explained, keeping my voice calm. Then why does she act like that? Vitaliera's annoyance was still palpable, her voice sharp with frustration. Well, I began thoughtfully, to keep it simple. It seems she's always been taught that a commoner must obey the words of a noble, and that a noble should lead the commoners and take responsibility for them. It's not superiority, it's duty. At least, that's what she believes. Duty, huh? Vitaliera let out an exasperated huff, clearly unimpressed. Doesn't change the fact that she's annoying. I chuckled again. You really don't like her, do you? Humph! Was all the response I got, her tail flicking against my cheek as she turned her head away. I could practically feel her pouting, even if she didn't say anything outright. Shaking my head in amusement, I kept walking, letting the soft sounds of the city envelop us. The streets were quieter now, with fewer people out and about as the evening settled in. The air was cool, the breeze refreshing against my skin. For the first time in a while, I felt a strange sense of calm, a feeling that life, chaotic as it might be, was starting to return to its usual unpredictable flow. The duel with Valeria lingered in my mind, the memory of it vivid and sharp. She had been talented, that much was clear. Despite her rigid adherence to form and technique, she was no pushover. In fact, even though I had bested her, it hadn't been as easy as I'd expected. I hadn't let any lethal intent slip into my strikes. No hidden malice, no tricks meant to throw her off. It had been a straightforward, clean duel, but even then, she had responded to my movements with remarkable precision. Her reflexes were quick, her instincts sharp. She had been trained well, exceptionally well. And despite the clear physical disadvantage she had against me, she still managed to keep up, parrying most of my strikes and even countering when she saw an opening. That alone showed her raw talent. She's impressive, I murmured to myself, the smile still playing on my lips. Impressive, Vitaliera echoed, incredulous. You call that impressive? She lost. She lost, I agreed, nodding slightly, but the way she fought was something else. She responded to almost every strike, even though I was holding back. Physically, she was at a disadvantage, but she didn't let that stop her. Her instincts were sharp. Vitaliera let out a soft hum, clearly not convinced. Still annoying, though. I get it, humph, came the quick reply, her tail flicking again. But I guess that explains how the situation here was resolved. Even if I had not intervened, at some point, she would have come here if the barrow had put the notice. This land would not be able to sustain the bandits any longer. Someone was needed to solve this problem, and it now became evident that who that person was. Valeria strode back towards the meeting point where her squad of knights awaited her. The tension from the duel still buzzed through her veins, though she did her best to mask her irritation with a calm, collected facade. The 6 knights, each dressed in the Olarian crest, stood in a loose formation near the outskirts of the town, their eyes immediately locking onto her as she approached. Lady Valeria, one of them, a tall man with a broad build named Aldrich, called out as she drew near. His tone was respectful but curious. Where were you? Did you meet with that Lucavian? The moment his name left Aldrich's mouth, Valeria's teeth clenched. Lucavian. Just hearing the name made the frustration bubble up again. She had been outmaneuvered, and the sting of that loss was still fresh in her mind. The last thing she wanted was to talk about it. Yes, I did, she replied curtly, her tone clipped and her expression tight as she avoided eye contact. But we won't speak of it. The knights exchanged glances, clearly sensing her foul mood but unsure of what exactly had happened. Aldrich opened his mouth to say something, but the sharpness in Valeria's gaze quickly silenced him. There was an unspoken command in her eyes. Don't push me on this. One of the younger knights, a wiry man named Tom, shifted awkwardly before daring to speak. So, did he live up to the stories, my lady? Valeria shot him a glare that could cut through steel. Enough, she snapped, her voice colder than she intended. We've been traveling for days. We need rest. She straightened, her expression hardening into one of authority as she motioned towards the town's inn. We're heading there now. No more talk of this. The group fell silent at once, none of them daring to push further. They had all seen Valeria in foul moods before, but there was something different about this one. Whatever had happened between her and Lucavian, it had clearly gotten under her skin in a way few things ever did. Without another word, Valeria turned on her heel and led the way towards the inn, her frustration simmering just beneath the surface. The knights followed in silence, not daring to speak another word about the man who had clearly shaken their usually unflappable leader. The dawn was yet to break, the sky still a deep shade of indigo as the quiet town lay in the pre-dawn stillness. Valeria had already risen, her breath steady and controlled as she prepared herself for her morning routine. The discipline of her training had been engraved into her very bones since childhood, a habit she could never break, even on days like this when her mind was clouded with frustration. She slipped into her simple training gear, her mind sharp as she tied her boots. The rhythmic sound of the leather pulling tight helped steady her focus. This was how she always began her day, a run to clear her mind and center her thoughts before diving into the more grueling aspects of her training. It had never failed her before, and she needed it more than ever now, after the events of the previous day. Valeria opened the door to her room, the cool morning air greeting her as she stepped into the hallway. But just as she began to move forward, the door to the room directly across from hers creaked open, and out stepped someone she had no desire to see so early in the morning. Lucavian. Her heart skipped a beat, and not in the pleasant way. No, this was the kind of jolt that came from pure, unfiltered annoyance. Of all the people, she thought, gritting her teeth as her eyes locked onto his figure. Lucavian, ever the insufferable presence, looked just as relaxed as he had the day before, as if nothing ever disturbed him. He glanced at her, his expression lighting up with that infuriatingly easy smile, like running into her was the most amusing thing in the world. "Morning," he greeted casually, his voice carrying that same relaxed tone she had grown to despise. Valeria's jaw tightened as she forced herself to remain composed. Of course, it had to be him. She wasn't in the mood for pleasantries, let alone another verbal sparring session. But there he was, standing in front of her as if the gods themselves had decided to test her patience once more. "I see you're up early," Lucavian continued, his tone light. "Going for a run?" Valeria exhaled slowly through her nose, her irritation barely contained. "Yes," she said shortly, stepping past him without waiting for a reply. She didn't have time for his teasing, not today. Not after how he had beaten her so easily the day before. But Lucavian didn't move. Instead, he turned slightly as she passed, watching her with that same amused look. "Mind if I join you?" Valeria stopped in her tracks, her shoulders tensing. She turned her head just enough to glance at him over her shoulder, her eyes narrowing. "You want to join me?" Lucavian shrugged, completely nonchalant. "Why not? We are both going to train anyway, and running alone is quite boring." Valeria's fists clenched at her sides. She had hoped for some peace, a moment to clear her mind, and now this infuriating man was trying to worm his way into that too. The last thing she wanted was to spend more time with him, especially when the memory of her defeat still burned fresh in her mind. "No," she said firmly, her voice cold. "I prefer to run alone." "I see," he answered. Yet, just a minute later, she couldn't help but curse inwardly. "Why are you following me?" Chapter 144. Annoying 2. I had just stepped out of my room, the pre-dawn chill seeping into my skin as I stretched my arms overhead. The sky was still a deep indigo, the quiet of the early morning undisturbed, save for the soft creak of doors and the occasional whisper of wind through the empty streets. It was the perfect time for my usual morning run. No distractions, no crowds, just the stillness of the world and the steady rhythm of my feet hitting the ground. At least, that's what I thought until I saw her stepping out of her room across the hall. Valeria. Of course, it had to be her. The moment our eyes met, I couldn't help the small grin that tugged at my lips. She looked as composed as ever, dressed in simple training gear, her expression stern and focused. But there was a sharpness to her that I recognized all too well. Yesterday's duel was still fresh in her mind, and judging by the tightness in her posture, it wasn't a pleasant memory for her. "Morning," I greeted, keeping my tone light, almost casual. I could see the way her jaw tightened at the sound of my voice, which only made me smile a little wider. Annoying her had become an oddly enjoyable pastime. She didn't bother to reply at first, just gave me a curt nod and began moving down the hallway. Her steps were quick, deliberate, like she was trying to escape before I could say anything else. "I see you're up early," I continued, watching her with amusement. "Going for a run?" "Yes," she said shortly, not even glancing back as she brushed past me, clearly hoping to leave the conversation at that. Her voice was cold, clipped, and I could practically feel the frustration rolling off her in waves. But of course, I couldn't let her off that easily. "Mind if I join you?" I asked, matching her pace without hesitation. She stopped, her shoulders visibly tensing as she turned just enough to give me a withering glare over her shoulder. "You want to join me?" I shrugged, keeping my expression neutral, though I could feel the teasing glint in my eyes. "Why not? We're both up, both training. Running alone can get pretty dull, don't you think?" Her fists clenched at her sides, and for a brief second, I thought she might actually tell me off. But instead, she just turned back around and started walking again, her steps faster this time. "No," she said firmly, her voice even colder than before. "I prefer to run alone." "I see," I replied easily, falling into step behind her. She might have wanted to run alone, but I had no intention of leaving her be. Not because I enjoyed tormenting her, though I'd be lying if I said I didn't find her reactions amusing, but because this just so happened to be the exact route I always took for my morning runs. What a coincidence. Well, it was not a coincidence most likely, as this route just had the widest streets, which was also easier and more refreshing to run. A few minutes passed as we made our way through the quiet streets, the sound of our footsteps echoing softly against the cobblestones. She was trying to ignore me, that much was obvious, but I could tell by the way her shoulders twitched slightly that my presence was bothering her more than she'd care to admit. And then, finally, after another few moments of tense silence, she snapped. "Why are you following me?" Valeria demanded, stopping abruptly and turning to face me, her violet eyes blazing with irritation. I paused as well, raising an eyebrow as I looked at her. "Following you?" I repeated, feigning innocence. "I'm just running." Her glare didn't waver. "We've been taking the same route for the past 10 minutes. "Well," I said, flashing her a playful grin, "this just happens to be my usual route. I always run this way in the mornings. I'm not following you. You're just in my way." Valeria's eyes narrowed further, her annoyance clearly growing. "In your way," she echoed, her tone sharp. I shrugged again, keeping my grin firmly in place. "What can I say? You're blocking my path. But if it makes you feel better, you're more than welcome to follow me." Her fists tightened at her sides, and for a moment, I thought she might actually take a swing at me. But instead, she just turned back around with a huff and resumed her run, this time picking up the pace, as if she could outrun me through sheer willpower. Naturally, I matched her speed, easily keeping up. It wasn't hard. She was fast, but I was faster. "So," I called out as I ran beside her, "what are we trying to accomplish this morning? Speed? Endurance? Or are we just working off that leftover frustration from yesterday?" She didn't respond, but the way her jaw tightened told me everything I needed to know. I stifled a laugh, knowing full well that my presence was driving her up the wall. "I'm guessing it's frustration," I continued, undeterred. "I get it, though. Yesterday was rough. You," she said through gritted teeth, "I swear, if you don't stop talking." "What?" I asked, my voice light and teasing. Valeria shot me a withering glare, her violet eyes narrowing with enough intensity to make anyone else back off. But not me. I kept running beside her, matching her pace with ease, my smile widening at her obvious irritation. She didn't say anything, though, just clenched her jaw tighter and focused on the road ahead, as if pretending I wasn't there would somehow make me disappear. Seeing her stubborn silence, I decided to change tactics. Maybe getting under her skin wasn't the most productive way to pass the time. "So," I said after a few more moments of running in silence, "what's your plan now?" Her eyes flicked toward me briefly, her expression suspicious. I could almost hear her asking herself why I cared. But she didn't voice it. She just kept running. I pressed on anyway. "Now that we're both here and the opportunity we came for has, well, let's say vanished," I continued, "do you have another plan?" That seemed to hit a nerve. Valeria's fists tightened again. But this time, it wasn't just from irritation. The question clearly struck deeper than I'd intended. She slowed her pace ever so slightly, just enough to let me know that I had her attention, even if she wasn't ready to answer yet. After a beat, she finally spoke, her voice sharp and defensive. "Why do you care? Does it concern you?" I shrugged, keeping my tone light. "Fair enough. It's not really my business. But since I'm the one who, took that opportunity, I figured I might as well ask. My conscience is feeling a little guilty." Her gaze shifted to me again, her expression unreadable. For a split second, I thought she might actually believe I was being sincere, but the moment passed quickly, and she huffed, shaking her head. "No," she said firmly, her voice colder than the morning air. "You don't have a conscience. That is a little bit rude, don't you think? You are being rude, intruding on my space in the morning. You make it sound like I am harassing you." Valeria stopped abruptly, her violet eyes blazing as she turned to face me, her expression tight with irritation. "Because you are," she snapped, her tone sharp as the morning chill. "You're following me, teasing me, and now pretending to care about my plans. So yes, I'd call that harassment." I raised my hands in a mock display of surrender, a playful grin still tugging at my lips. "Whoa, whoa. I'm just making conversation, I said, keeping my voice calm and light. No need to get so defensive. Defensive? She echoed, her tone incredulous. You're invading my personal space. I took a step back, deliberately exaggerated, and gestured around. Well, forgive me for running on the same public road. It's not like I'm following you on purpose. Her eyes narrowed. Feels like it. Really? Valeria's eyes narrowed even further as she glared at me, her irritation practically radiating off her. Yes, she said sharply, her voice cold. It feels like it. I nodded, keeping my smile in place. Well, if that's the case, I'll leave you to it. I took a step back, my tone still casual, though a hint of playfulness crept into my voice. Wouldn't want to ruin your morning routine any more than I already have. Before she could respond, I suddenly sped up, darting ahead of her with a quick burst of speed. The wind whipped past me as I left her behind, my feet pounding rhythmically against the cobblestones. I didn't look back, but I could practically feel her stunned silence at my sudden retreat. Well, that was enough fun for the time being. While it was not bad talking to someone after a while, any more than that, I would really be crossing the line. I mean, at the very least, that is how I felt. Don't glare at me like that. Humph. And there was also this cat here. She was really sulky. I am open to any criticism. You can comment on things that you would like to see in the story. And if you liked my story, please give me a power stone. It helps me a lot. Chapter 145. Behind the scenes. As Lucavian sped away, Valeria found herself standing in the quiet street, the early morning air cool against her flushed skin. She watched his retreating figure for a moment longer, her fists still clenched at her sides. His presence had been infuriating, and yet, the words he had left behind lingered in her mind, gnawing at her. What's your plan now? She huffed, starting her run again, though the steady rhythm of her footsteps felt less purposeful than before. The question, though framed in his usual irritating, playful tone, had struck something deeper. What was her plan now? She had come here to prove herself, to challenge a dangerous bandit leader, and to make a name for herself before her upcoming entrance to the academy. But with Lucavian having already defeated Corvin, that chance had been taken from her. What am I supposed to do now? She thought, her pace slowing as the question weighed heavier on her mind. After all, both her team and her family were expecting quite a lot from her. Coming to this place had already cost her a significant amount of time. The journey from her family's mansion had taken nearly a week, and that was with minimal stops. Her squad and their horses had been pushed to the limit, and now the animals were exhausted, needing at least 3 full days of rest before they could make the return journey. Even then, the trip back would take just as long, meaning that by the time she returned home, nearly 3 weeks would have been wasted. And what did she have to show for it? Nothing. No victory, no recognition, no bandit leader's head to present as proof of her skill. Lucavian had robbed her of that chance, taking down Corvin before she even had the opportunity to face him. Now, all she had was the sting of defeat and the gnawing uncertainty of what came next. The frustration built inside her, making each step feel heavier, her breath coming in short, irritated bursts. 3 weeks, she thought bitterly. 3 weeks, and I've achieved nothing. It wasn't just about the lost time, though that was part of it. Her family had expectations, high expectations. She had been raised with the weight of her family's honor on her shoulders, drilled into her since childhood, and every action she took reflected on the Olarian name. And now, here she was, having spent weeks on a fruitless mission. She had nothing to show for it, and worse, she had allowed her pride to get the better of her. Valeria clenched her fists as she remembered the moment at the inn when she had revealed her identity. It had been a stupid move, one that she regretted almost immediately. She had planned to keep her name hidden, to operate quietly so that any success she achieved would speak for itself. The rumors about her would be much more genuine if people didn't know she was a noble until after she had proven her worth. But no, that bastard had gotten under her skin. His taunting, his smug smile, the way he spoke as if he had already figured her out. It had been too much. She'd let herself get agitated, and before she knew it, She had revealed her name in front of everyone at the inn. Valeria Olarian, daughter of House Olarian, she had said, as if throwing her title around would somehow restore the dignity she felt slipping away in that moment. It was impulsive, born out of frustration. And now, because of that slip-up, she would have to go and pay respects to the noble overseeing this town. It was expected, of course. She couldn't just waltz into someone else's territory, cause a scene, and leave without acknowledging the local authority. That was how politics worked. But the thought of it only added to her annoyance. I was supposed to keep my head low, not draw attention to myself like some fool, but thanks to Lucavian and her own pride, she had done exactly the opposite. Valeria's steps slowed to a near halt as she let out a long, frustrated breath. This entire trip felt like a failure. 3 weeks of time wasted. Yet, she hadn't thought she would get the opportunity this soon. Later that day, Valeria stood beside the mirror. She was dressed in formal attire, the crisp lines of her outfit perfectly tailored to reflect her station as a noble of the Olarian family. The Olarian crest, embroidered in gold on her chest, was a clear reminder of her rank, far above that of a mere baron. Her squad of knights accompanied her, though they maintained a respectful distance as she walked through the halls of the baron's modest estate. It was a far cry from the grandeur of her own family's mansion, but it was well kept, with an air of quiet dignity. The doors to the receiving room opened, and Valeria stepped inside, her head held high as she prepared to meet the baron. She had expected a typical display of arrogance, the kind that lesser nobles often put on when meeting someone of her rank. But when she saw Baron Edris Windhall, her expectations were immediately dashed. Baron Windhall rose to greet her, his manner calm and unpretentious. He was a man of middle age, his face marked by lines that spoke of experience rather than vanity. His hair, streaked with silver, was neatly combed, but his attire, while formal, lacked the extravagant flair so often seen among the nobility. There was no gaudy jewelry, no excessive displays of wealth, just a simple man of his station doing his duty. "Lady Valeria Olarian," he said, his voice steady and respectful as he bowed deeply. "It is an honor to welcome you to Windhall. I trust your journey has been well." Valeria inclined her head, returning his bow with a measured one of her own. "Baron Windhall, thank you for receiving me," she replied, her voice polite but formal. "The journey has been as expected. I appreciate your hospitality." Baron Windhall straightened, offering her a small smile before gesturing toward the table where tea had already been prepared. "Please join me. I thought we could enjoy a local delicacy, puff pastries made with honey from our nearby apiary. I hope it will suit your taste." Valeria's gaze flicked to the simple tea set and the delicate pastries arranged on the table. It was a far cry from the opulent feasts served at her own home, but she found herself oddly relieved by the lack of pretension. It made the visit feel less like a chore. "Of course," she said, moving to take her seat opposite the baron. Her posture was immaculate, and every movement was precise and measured to befit her station. Her knights stood by the door, maintaining a respectful distance as they awaited further instructions. Baron Windhall poured the tea himself, a simple gesture that spoke volumes about his character. Most nobles would have servants handle such tasks, but here he was, personally attending to her. Valeria accepted the cup with a nod of thanks, taking a small sip before turning her attention back to the baron. "I must say," Baron Windhall began, his tone courteous, "it is quite rare for someone of your esteemed family to visit this region." Valeria nodded in acknowledgement of Baron Windhall's words, her expression carefully composed. "Indeed, I came here after being informed by the capital of the bandit threat in your territory. It was my intention to deal with the problem, as appointed by the crown." At her words, the baron stiffened, his face betraying a brief flicker of concern. It was a subtle shift, but Valeria caught it. He lowered his teacup gently onto the table, the porcelain clinking softly as he composed himself. "Ah, I see," Baron Windhall said slowly, his voice carefully measured. "I must apologize for the miscommunication, Lady Olarian. The matter with the bandits was resolved more swiftly than expected. After our garrison and Sir Lucavian dealt with Corvin and his men, I immediately sent word to the capital to withdraw the decree. I had hoped to avoid any further inconvenience, but it seems the message may not have reached you in time. Valeria kept her expression neutral, though the memory of Lucavian's smug grin flashed in her mind, irritating her once again. Still, she maintained her polite facade, offering the Baron a small, courteous smile. "It is not your fault, Baron Windhall," she said calmly. "These things happen. It was simply unfortunate timing on my part." The Baron visibly relaxed at her response, the tension that had briefly clouded his features easing. He had clearly been on edge, worried that she might hold him personally accountable for the wasted time and effort. Valeria could sense his relief, though he remained careful in his demeanor. "Thank you for your understanding, Lady Olarian," Baron Windhall said, inclining his head respectfully. "I truly regret that your efforts have been in vain. Had I known someone of your standing would be involved, I would have ensured the situation was communicated more clearly." Valeria waved a hand gracefully, dismissing the need for further apologies. "Think nothing of it. The important thing is that the threat has been dealt with, and your people are safe." Baron Windhall nodded gratefully, his shoulders loosening as the weight of the situation seemed to lift. "Thank you for your understanding, Lady Olarian." Baron Windhall, now noticeably more at ease, offered Valeria a gracious smile. The tension that had initially hung in the air dissipated, and their conversation turned to lighter matters. They exchanged a few pleasantries, discussing the state of the region, the quality of the local harvest, and the Baron's ongoing efforts to ensure the prosperity of his lands. "You have managed this barony well," Valeria remarked, her voice polite yet formal. "It is no small task to keep order in such times." The Baron bowed his head humbly. "Thank you, Lady Olarian. It is my duty, and I take great pride in the welfare of my people. However, I must say, your presence here has been a rare honor. If you would allow it, I would be more than happy to offer you and your retinue accommodations for the duration of your stay." "It is the least I can do." Valeria shook her head slightly, her expression remaining cordial. "I appreciate the offer, Baron Windhall, but my men and I have already made arrangements at the inn. We will not impose upon your household." The Baron nodded, understanding her decision but still eager to show hospitality. "As you wish, Lady Olarian. Should you need anything during your stay, do not hesitate to call upon me." Valeria inclined her head in acknowledgement, appreciating his deference but eager to conclude the formalities. The conversation, while necessary, had run its course. She had more pressing matters on her mind, and lingering in pleasantries would not change that. "What are your plans now, if I may ask?" the Baron inquired, his tone respectful yet curious. Valeria paused for a moment, considering her response. "I will remain here for a short while to allow my knights and horses to rest. After that, we will most likely return to the capital." Baron Windhall's eyes lit up with an idea, and he leaned forward slightly. "In that case, may I offer a suggestion, Lady Olarian? I was recently informed that a martial tournament is being organized in the city of Andalheim, hosted by Marquis Aldrich Venter. It is said to attract skilled warriors from all across the kingdom and beyond." Hearing that, her interest was piqued. Chapter 146. Getting the Blade. "In that case, may I offer a suggestion, Lady Olarian? I was recently informed that a martial tournament is being organized in the city of Andalheim, hosted by Marquis Aldrich Venter. It is said to attract skilled warriors from all across the kingdom and beyond." Valeria's interest was piqued, though she maintained her composed demeanor. "A martial tournament?" "Indeed," the Baron continued. "It is set to take place in 2 weeks' time, and from what I understand, it promises to be quite the spectacle. Many of the finest knights and swordsmen will be in attendance, and it could present an excellent opportunity for someone of your talents to demonstrate their skill." The Baron's words hung in the air, and Valeria's thoughts began to swirl. A martial tournament, it was certainly tempting. Not only would it allow her to test her abilities against other skilled fighters, but it would also offer her the chance to restore some of the pride she had lost during this ill-fated journey. Competing on such a stage could provide the recognition she sought before her entrance to the academy. Andelheim is not far from here, the Baron added, sensing her contemplation. You could easily reach it after a few days' rest. Valeria's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. And who is expected to attend this tournament? Many prominent figures, both from noble houses and renowned mercenary groups. Marquis Venter himself is a well-known patron of the martial arts, and he often invites the most skilled warriors to his tournaments. The event is sure to attract attention from many corners of the kingdom. Valeria considered the Baron's suggestion carefully. It was true that her original plan had fallen apart with Corvin's defeat, but the tournament in Andelheim could be exactly the kind of opportunity she needed. If she performed well, it would not only showcase her abilities but also reflect favorably on her family. I will consider it, Valeria finally said, her tone decisive but non-committal. It could indeed be a worthwhile endeavor. The Baron smiled, clearly pleased. I think you would find it most rewarding, Lady Olarian, and should you decide to attend, I would be happy to provide any assistance you require. Valeria observed the Baron closely as he spoke. His suggestion, though presented as casual advice, was more than just that. It was a subtle attempt to offer her an alternative path after her failed mission. The Baron, while courteous, was undoubtedly aware of the significance of her journey, and by offering the tournament as an opportunity, he was giving her a graceful way to salvage her reputation without dwelling on the mischance with Corvin. For that, she was quietly thankful. Baron Windhall's offer of assistance, too, was not lost on her. Though he was a lower-ranked noble, his words carried the weight of someone who understood the intricacies of noble politics. By providing her with this alternative, he was, in his own way, ensuring that the Olarian name wouldn't be tarnished by an ill-timed miscommunication. I appreciate your suggestion, Valeria said, her voice softening just slightly. And I see the wisdom in it. The Baron inclined his head, clearly relieved that she had taken his words in stride. It is my duty to assist, Lady Olarian. And should you require anything for your journey or your stay in Andelheim, I will ensure that my resources are at your disposal. Valeria offered a small, measured smile. You have been most gracious, Baron Windhall. I will keep your offer in mind. They exchanged a few more pleasantries, their conversation light, touching on the state of the region and the upcoming harvest. But Valeria's mind was already set. She would stay a few more days to rest, as planned, and then make her way to Andelheim. The tournament would be her chance to reclaim her standing. After a short while, Valeria rose from her seat, signaling the end of their meeting. Thank you again for your hospitality, Baron, she said, her tone formal but sincere. I will take my leave now. Baron Windhall stood and bowed deeply. It has been an honor, Lady Olarian. Safe travels, and I hope to see you victorious in the tournament. With a final nod, Valeria turned and exited the mansion, her knights following behind her. As she stepped out into the fresh air, she felt a small measure of relief. Maybe that tournament might really help. The Baron had given her the out she needed, and now, with the tournament on the horizon, she had a new goal to focus on. While Valeria was meeting with the Baron, Lucavian walked to the smithy. A week had passed since his last visit, and during that time, he had felt the anticipation steadily building. He had done everything that was asked of him. Now, the promised time had come. His weapon, crafted from the scales of the abyssal Wyrm, should be ready. He stopped in front of the smithy, its unassuming exterior hiding the power and precision being worked inside. The rhythmic clang of hammer against metal was absent this time, replaced by an almost eerie stillness. Lucavian hesitated for a brief moment before raising his hand and knocking on the door. His knuckles made a solid, echoing sound against the worn wood. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, the familiar creak of the door opening revealed Harlan standing there, wiping his hands on a rag, his face as unreadable as ever. About time, Harlan muttered, stepping aside to let Lucavian in. Figured you'd come sooner, considering how you've been pacing around town like a restless dog. Lucavian couldn't help but smirk at the comment, but said nothing as he stepped inside. The familiar warmth of the forge wrapped around him as he took in the room, noticing that it was far more organized than it had been the last time he was here. The tools were neatly arranged, and the racks of old weapons seemed to have been cleared. Harlan motioned toward the back of the smithy, where something long and wrapped in a black cloth lay on a stone table. Lucavian's eyes immediately locked onto it, his pulse quickening. "Go on, lad," Harlan said, his tone gruff but carrying a hint of something more. Pride, perhaps. "Your blade's ready." Lucavian approached the table, his heart pounding with anticipation. With a steady hand, he pulled back the black cloth, revealing the weapon underneath. The blade was magnificent. Its length gleamed with a faint, ethereal glow, the edge as sharp as a predator's fang. The scales of the abyssal wyrm were seamlessly integrated into the metal, giving the sword an otherworldly sheen. The blade itself was sleek, balanced perfectly between power and grace, its design radiating an aura of lethal elegance. Lucavian's hand hovered over the hilt for a moment, feeling the subtle pull of the weapon before he finally gripped it, lifting it from the table. The estoc felt impossibly light in his hand, as though it was meant for him and him alone. Harlan crossed his arms, watching him closely. "It's not just a sword, lad. It's a beast. You'll feel its power the moment you swing it. It's ready for whatever hell you're planning to drag it into. But it won't forgive you if you wield it like a brute." Lucavian gripped the hilt of the blade tighter, the cold flame from his second core flickering to life in response to the weapon. There was an undeniable connection between the two, a resonance that stirred something deep within him. The abyssal wyrm scales weren't just another material. They were in tune with the energy he carried, amplifying the power that simmered just beneath his skin. "This blade," he whispered to himself, a quiet awe lacing his words. "It makes sense." Vitalyara's voice purred in his mind. "This is a weapon forged from the scales of a creature tied to the abyss. Its very nature resonates with your second core. The compatibility is far better than any ordinary sword you've wielded." Harlan's gravelly voice cut through the moment, bringing Lucavian back. "How's the blade, kid? Is it to your liking?" Lucavian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped back, bringing the sword up to eye level, feeling its weight, or rather the lack of it. Despite the size and the intimidating presence of the blade, it felt as though it belonged in his hand, an extension of his very being. Without a word, he swung the blade in a wide arc. Swoosh! The air seemed to ripple with the motion, the sword slicing through it as though it were silk. Lucavian spun the blade in his hand, letting it dance with quick, sharp movements. Each swing, each flick of his wrist was smooth and effortless. The blade moved exactly as he willed it to, responding to his every thought, his every intention. It was as if it had been forged specifically for him, tailored to match his movements, his strength, and the energy of his core. A slow smile crept across Lucavian's face as he continued to test the weapon, slashing through the air with increasing speed. There was no awkwardness, no imbalance. The blade was perfect. "This is incredible," Lucavian finally said, his voice carrying a note of reverence. He swung again, feeling the subtle power radiating from the blade as it resonated with his core. The weight, the balance, the energy, it was flawless. Harlan, watching from a few paces away, grunted in approval. It should be. Took me a damn long time to get it right." There was a hint of pride in the old man's voice, but it was subdued, masked by his usual gruff tone. "Every piece, every line of that sword is tailored to you, lad. It's not just a blade, it's a weapon that'll grow with you. I'd expect nothing less." Lucavian stopped mid-swing, looking at the blacksmith with newfound respect. He had always known Harlan was talented, one of the best, but this was something else entirely. The craftsmanship was beyond exceptional. It wasn't just about making a powerful weapon. Harlan had understood him, his style, his core, the path he was on, and had forged a blade that reflected all of that. Indeed, coming here for a weapon, it was the right choice. "You really are the greatest blacksmith I have seen," Lucavian said, his voice sincere. Harlan waved a hand dismissively, though Lucavian could tell the praise had landed. "Bah, you bastard. Just how many blacksmiths that you had seen in your life?" "3. I thought so." Still, Lucavian couldn't hide his gratitude. This blade was a gift, but it was also a challenge. A reminder that while the sword was powerful, its true potential would only be unlocked through his own growth and mastery. "This is more than I could have asked for," Lucavian said, sheathing the sword with a satisfying click. "Thank you." Harlan huffed but didn't deny the gratitude. "Just don't go dying before you make good use of it, lad. Otherwise, it'll be a waste of good scales." "Ahahaha. Do not worry, I won't." After all, he had quite a lot of plans for his upcoming blade. Chapter 147. Getting the Blade. The morning sun had yet to rise when Valeria stirred from her sleep. Sigh. It is a mess. Her mind, already active, seemed to have been awake long before her body, preoccupied with thoughts of what lay ahead. She had spent much of the night thinking about the tournament in Andelheim, the opportunity it presented, and the pressure that came with it. This was no ordinary competition. This was her chance to reclaim her pride, to prove her worth as a knight, and to restore some dignity after her ill-fated trip. Valeria sat up, her violet eyes blinking against the dim light filtering through the curtains. Her thoughts were already on her training. As always, discipline was the foundation of her morning. No matter how much weighed on her mind, her routine never faltered. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, the cool floor meeting her bare feet, and moved with the efficiency of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Every motion was deliberate, there was no time to waste. The pressure on her shoulders, the expectations of her family, and her personal need to excel were all driving forces that kept her moving forward. As she dressed in her training gear, her mind raced through the tasks for the day. The training today needed to be precise and focused. She couldn't afford to be distracted by the events of the previous days and certainly not by the annoying presence of him. Valeria stepped out of her room, the air crisp in the early morning. She glanced across the hallway instinctively, half expecting to see Lucavian emerge from the room opposite hers, ready to provoke her as he had done the previous morning. But the hallway was empty, quiet. There was no infuriating grin waiting to greet her, no casual teasing to throw her off balance. A small sense of relief washed over her. That is how it is supposed to be, she thought, her lips twitching into the faintest hint of a smile. Peace and quiet, as Valeria began her morning run. The steady rhythm of her feet against the cobblestones provided a much-needed distraction from the swirling thoughts in her mind. The air was cool, each breath filling her lungs with the crispness of dawn, but despite the physical clarity, her mind remained occupied. The tournament, the opportunity it presented was undeniable. Marquis Venter's martial tournament would attract skilled fighters from across the kingdom, and winning, or even performing well, could elevate her name and reputation. She would have the chance to prove her abilities on a public stage, something she sorely needed after the debacle with Corvin. It would be the perfect opportunity to salvage her trip, to return to her family with some form of victory. But there were risks. Valeria's pace quickened as her thoughts deepened. The tournament wasn't just a showcase. It was a battlefield of its own. Skilled knights, mercenaries, and fighters of all kinds would be competing. Any slip, any weakness could result in injury or worse. And then there was the matter of her family. What would they think? Her father, in particular, might see this as reckless, a distraction from the path laid out for her. And it wasn't just about her. She wasn't traveling alone. The 6 knights who accompanied her were a force in their own right, each skilled, loyal, and representing the Olarian name. Each of them had been chosen for this mission because of their loyalty and skill, all representing the honor and prestige of House Olarian. They were her protectors, tasked with ensuring her safety as the heir to the family. But the more she thought about the upcoming tournament in Andelheim, the more she realized that taking them along might not be necessary, and could even complicate things. I know they're here to protect me, but that place must be safe at least, she reasoned. Marquis Venter's tournament would be a high-profile event, drawing attention from nobles, skilled fighters, and the upper echelon of society. The Marquis himself would ensure the safety of the participants, both for the sake of the competition's prestige and the nobility in attendance. In that kind of environment, her knights might not be as essential as they would in more dangerous or unknown territory. It's not just about protection, she mused. It's about my own image, my independence. The more Valeria considered it, the clearer it became. Her knights had been with her every step of the way, shielding her from danger as was their duty. But this tournament? This was different. It wasn't about life-threatening battles or covert missions. It was about skill, honor, and reputation. If she took her knights along, it could seem as though she was relying too heavily on her family's protection. Worse, it might give the impression that she wasn't capable of handling herself on her own. That thought stung her pride. Valeria had worked too hard, trained too long, to be seen as simply the heir of a noble house who couldn't stand on her own in battle. She needed to prove herself, not just to her family but to the wider world. And this tournament could be the perfect opportunity. I may deal with this on my own, she decided, her pace slowing as the thought solidified in her mind. The Marquis will have accommodations prepared for the fighters, and I'll be able to handle myself without the need for my knights to hover over me. The more she thought about it, the more the idea made sense. Her knights were valuable, of course, and there would always be a time when their protection was necessary. But not here. Not at this tournament. This was her chance to shine, to prove that she didn't need to lean on her family's name or their resources to succeed. She could already imagine the look on her father's face when she returned home, victorious and independent, having faced a challenge on her own terms. The thought spurred her forward, her steps regaining their purpose. I'll leave the knights here, Valeria concluded. Andalheim is my challenge to face alone. But as Valeria continued her run, her mind thought of something else. The idea of going to Andalheim alone appealed to her fiercely, but the question of how lingered like a heavy weight. How could she convince her knights to let her go without them? More importantly, how could she oppose the explicit orders from her family that required them to stay by her side? She knew the knights well. Each of them was steadfast, loyal to a fault, and deeply committed to their duty of protecting her. They had been handpicked by her father for this very reason. They weren't just soldiers, they were guardians of the Olarian legacy. And while they respected her authority as the heir, Valeria understood that when it came to her safety, they were ultimately beholden to her father's orders. If she simply told them she wanted to attend the tournament alone, they wouldn't listen. They wouldn't disobey her, but they wouldn't leave her side, either. They would insist on following her, believing it their duty to protect her, even if it wasn't necessary. What excuse could I possibly give them? She wondered, her pace slowing slightly as the weight of the dilemma pressed on her. She couldn't lie to them, not directly. They would see through any weak reasoning, especially if it involved her safety. And even if she were to insist that she wanted to face the tournament alone, they would argue that the competition could be just as dangerous as any battlefield. No, they wouldn't leave her side willingly. Maybe if I framed it as a political move, she thought, but even that felt flimsy. What political maneuver could justify leaving behind her protectors? She was stuck, trapped between her desire for independence and the rigid duty that bound her knights to her. Valeria's fists clenched as the frustration gnawed at her. It wasn't just about proving herself anymore. This was about more than just one tournament. This was about her ability to take control of her own life, her own destiny. She didn't want to be the sheltered heir who could only succeed with a retinue of knights at her back. She wanted to show her strength, to carve her own path, without the constant reminder that her family's name was what protected her. Valeria's feet pounded rhythmically against the ground as her mind churned through the same questions over and over again. No solution seemed to present itself, and the more she thought about it, the more frustrated she became. She had finished her run, but the tension in her chest remained, tightening with each passing moment. Her training, which usually cleared her mind, had done little to help today. She wiped the sweat from her brow as she neared the inn, her pace slowing. She was no closer to finding a way to handle the situation with her knights, and that feeling of helplessness was gnawing at her. Maybe I'll figure it out after a bath, she thought, letting out a long breath as she approached the entrance of the inn. Just as she was about to enter, her sharp senses picked up the sound of voices inside, faint but clear. One of the voices immediately caught her attention, causing her to pause mid-step. That infuriating voice, Lucavian. Valeria hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the door handle as she strained to hear the conversation. His voice carried that same casual, easygoing tone that had irritated her endlessly. "I'm really leaving," Lucavian was saying, his voice light. "You're leaving so soon?" The innkeeper's voice, warm and motherly, reached her ears next. "But you've only been here a short while. Are you sure?" Valeria pressed herself against the wall just outside the inn, listening intently. Lucavian's reply was smooth, almost amused. "Yeah, I've been freeloading for long enough, don't you think? I came here for a reason, and that reason's dealt with. I can't stay here forever. But you're always welcome here, you know that," the innkeeper insisted. "You help this town a lot, and you're like family to us now." "Ahaha. Family? It is not a word to be used lightly," Lucavian chuckled, and Valeria could practically see his infuriating smile in her mind. "Well, that's kind of you to say, but I don't want to overstay my welcome. Besides, there's nothing left for me to do here. I'm moving on." Chapter 148. Small Talk. "Well, that's kind of you to say, but I don't want to overstay my welcome. Besides, there's nothing left for me to do here. I'm moving on." Valeria's eyes narrowed as she listened. So he was leaving the city. That meant he was done with whatever business had brought him here in the first place. Most likely the bandit problem. He had come and dealt with the bandit leader Corvin, and now he was free to go wherever he pleased. Sadly, she was not that free. Valeria pushed the door to the inn open, the heavy wood creaking slightly as she stepped inside. She had no desire to listen to any more of Lucavian's carefree banter, and the reminder that he was free to leave while she remained stuck in this situation only soured her mood further. The weight of her responsibilities pressed down on her, making her feel as if she was dragging her feet. As she entered, her eyes instinctively scanned the room, and sure enough, there he was, Lucavian, standing near the innkeeper, dressed in casual clothes. He looked completely at ease, as if he had no care in the world. The sight made her jaw tighten, her mood darkening further. How could he be so carefree when she was tangled in a mess of expectations and decisions? Before she could retreat to her room, hoping to avoid any conversation with him, Lucavian's gaze caught hers. And then, much to her annoyance, he greeted her. "Well, if it isn't Lady Valeria," he said, a grin spreading across his face. "You're up early again. Training, I assume?" His tone was casual, almost teasing, but she could see the sharpness behind his words. He always had a way of making everything sound like a joke, as if nothing truly mattered. And that grin, oh, how it grated on her nerves. "Lucavian," she acknowledged curtly, her voice devoid of the usual pleasantries. "I see you're still here." Her eyes flicked to the bag slung over his shoulder, clearly packed and ready for his departure. "Not for much longer," he replied with a shrug. "I'm leaving today, as you've probably heard." His eyes twinkled with amusement as if he knew she had overheard his conversation with the innkeeper. "My work here is done." Valeria forced a thin smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Must be nice," she said, the words more bitter than she intended. She quickly added, "to be free of obligations." Lucavian raised an eyebrow, clearly catching the tone of her voice. He looked as if pondering on something, and then his expression shifted instantly, his mischievous grin spreading across his face as he leaned slightly toward her, eyes twinkling with amusement. "Oh, something's bothering our dear Lady Valeria?" he asked, his tone playfully conspiratorial. "Ho ho, now this I must hear." Valeria's eyes narrowed dangerously, her irritation spiking as she crossed her arms, glaring at him. "It's nothing that concerns you," she said, her voice clipped and cold. She had no desire to share her thoughts with this smug man, and the last thing she needed was for him to poke fun at her current situation. But Lucavian, of course, was far from deterred. "Oh, I see," he said, tapping his chin thoughtfully as if he hadn't heard her. "A noble woman, weighed down by responsibilities. Must be quite the burden, huh?" His teasing voice was laced with false sympathy, the playful glint in his eyes only growing stronger. "Let me guess. Family obligations? A pesky political engagement? Or maybe—" His voice dropped to a low, dramatic whisper. A secret lover's quarrel? Valeria's glare intensified, her cheeks flushing slightly, though not from embarrassment. You are insufferable, she snapped, taking a step closer to him. And no, it's none of those ridiculous things you're imagining. Lucavian only grinned wider, clearly enjoying how easily he could get under her skin. Oh, but now I'm curious, he said, his tone light and teasing as ever. What could possibly be bothering Lady Valeria so much that she'd let it slip in conversation? He tilted his head, studying her with exaggerated intrigue. Don't tell me it's something serious, like, you're stuck here with no way out? Valeria's jaw tightened. She hated how perceptive he could be, even when he was teasing. It's nothing you need to concern yourself with, she repeated, though her voice lacked the sharpness it had before. Lucavian raised an eyebrow, catching the shift in her tone. Ah, so there is something then, he said with a sly smirk. Don't worry, I won't tell anyone, but I'm starting to think you're a little stuck. Valeria exhaled sharply, her frustration boiling over as she finally spoke, her words coming out in a rush. I'm not stuck. It's just, she paused, realizing she was on the verge of revealing more than she intended. But Lucavian's infuriating grin was all the encouragement she needed to continue. Fine, I have decisions to make, all right? And I'm not interested in your opinion about it. Lucavian feigned surprise, placing a hand dramatically over his heart. Decisions? Well, I'm shocked. Someone as capable as you, struggling with a dilemma? Surely not. Valeria's glare could have cut through steel. If you're finished with your games, I'll be on my way. But Lucavian didn't budge, his gaze still fixed on her, the teasing smile never leaving his face. Oh, come on, he said, leaning against the wall casually. You've already said it out loud. It must be something big if it's bothering you this much. Valeria clenched her fists, her temper flaring. She had been so careful to keep her thoughts private. But somehow, this infuriating man had managed to pry the truth out of her, even if only a little. Fine, she snapped, since you're so curious. What would you do if you were supposed to face a challenge alone? But you had a group of people who wouldn't leave you no matter what you said? Lucavian's expression shifted, his playful demeanor softening as he regarded her with a hint of surprise. That's it, he asked, his voice now laced with genuine bewilderment. He blinked at her as though expecting something much more dramatic. Valeria's irritation flared up instantly. Yes, that's what it is, she snapped, her eyes narrowing. What? Did you think it would be something else? She could feel her patience slipping, especially with that look on his face. It was as if he was mocking her all over again. For a second, Lucavian just stood there, staring at her. Then, without warning, he burst out laughing, the sound echoing through the quiet inn. It wasn't a polite chuckle or a teasing giggle. It was a full-blown, hearty laugh that made him double over, clutching his stomach. Valeria's face turned red with anger, her fists clenching tighter. What's so funny? She demanded, her voice sharp, but that only made him laugh harder. Oh, this is hilarious, Lucavian managed between laughs, wiping a tear from his eye. You're really stressing over something like that? He let out another chuckle, shaking his head. I was expecting some grand political scheme or a life-or-death dilemma. But this is rich. Valeria's blood boiled. And just what is so hilarious about it? She said through gritted teeth, her voice low and dangerous. Lucavian finally caught his breath, straightening up and grinning at her. It's just, here I was thinking the great Lady Valeria Olarian had some impossible riddle to solve. And it turns out you're just unable to see through such a simple thing. Valeria's eyes narrowed dangerously as she shot back. Simple, you say? Then tell me, how would you deal with it? Lucavian stopped laughing, the amusement in his eyes fading slightly as he straightened up, his expression now serious. Isn't it obvious? I just leave on my own. The casualness with which he said it, as though it was the easiest thing in the world, made Valeria's blood boil even more. She stepped forward, her fists clenched at her sides. Leave on your own? Just like that? And what about the people you leave behind? Don't you care about them at all? Lucavian tilted his head slightly as if genuinely puzzled by her outburst. However, there was something faint in his eyes. Something that did not quite match his demeanor. Care about them? If they knew me well, they'd understand my reasons. Surely, if they're loyal, they'd respect my decision, right? If they don't understand, then either they don't really know me or they don't care about what I want. Either way, it leads to the same conclusion. Valeria blinked, momentarily taken aback by his response. The sheer simplicity of his logic left her momentarily speechless. She had expected him to say something infuriatingly smug, but this was different. He wasn't mocking her, not this time. He was genuinely laying out his philosophy, one that was far removed from her own sense of duty and obligation. "And what if they don't understand?" she asked, her voice quieter now, though still laced with tension. "What if they feel betrayed? If they were to feel betrayed over such a small thing and you were to care about it all times, wouldn't that mean they are controlling you in some sort of way?" It was weirdly hard to refute. Lucavian shrugged nonchalantly. "If they feel betrayed, then that's on them. I can't live my life constantly worrying about how others feel. I have my own path and my own goals. If people truly care about me, they'll respect that. If not, well, they were never really loyal to begin with." Valeria stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. His perspective was completely foreign to her, a stark contrast to the world she had been raised in, where loyalty, duty, and family were everything. To just walk away, to make decisions solely for herself without considering the consequences for others. It was unthinkable. "You really believe that?" she asked, her voice quieter now, more curious than accusatory. Lucavian met her gaze, his expression steady. "Either you believe this or you will be forced to in the end." "Forced? Ah. Forget I said that." He made a slip. "I am open to any criticism. You can comment on things that you would like to see in the story. And if you liked my story, please give me a power stone. It helps me a lot." Chapter 149. Small Talk. For a brief moment, when Lucavian uttered the word, "forced to," his expression shifted, and something dark flickered in his eyes. It was a rare, almost unguarded moment that made Valeria pause. The cool, nonchalant air that usually surrounded him faltered just for a second. It was unsettling, but as quickly as it had appeared, the moment was gone. Lucavian's trademark grin returned as if nothing had happened. He brushed off her questioning look with a light wave of his hand. "Forget I said that," he repeated, his voice returning to its usual playful tone, though something about it seemed forced now. Valeria narrowed her eyes, sensing that there was more to those words than he let on. But before she could press further, he continued. "Look," he said, leaning back against the wall again, his casual demeanor slipping back into place. "Those who really care about you, who know you well, they'll trust your actions. They'll believe in the kind of person you are. If you have faith in them, just trust that they'll understand in the end." He smiled, though this time, there was a softness to it that hadn't been there before. "And if they don't?" Lucavian paused for a moment, the silence stretching between them. It wasn't like his usual playful pauses, where he seemed to be on the verge of teasing or saying something clever. No, this was different. His smile faded just a fraction, his expression thoughtful, almost distant, as if her question had touched on something deeper, something he wasn't sure he wanted to share. For a fleeting moment, Valeria thought she saw a glimpse of something more, something heavy behind his eyes. But then, just as quickly, the mask returned. His grin softened, though it didn't quite reach his eyes this time. "Let's hope such a thing never happens," he said, his voice quieter, almost resigned. It was a strange answer, lacking the bravado he usually carried with him. And then, before she could press further, he turned away, his steps slow and deliberate as he began to leave. As he moved down the hallway, he stopped just before reaching the door, glancing over his shoulder one last time. His eyes met hers, and this time, his smile wasn't teasing but knowing, almost as if he was offering her a piece of advice. Though Valeria couldn't tell if it was meant for her or for himself. "Sometimes," he said, his voice low but clear, "bending the rules for the path you believe in isn't wrong. With that, he walked out of the inn, leaving Valeria standing in the hallway, his words echoing in her mind. Bending the rules for the path you believe in. She remained still for a moment, her thoughts swirling around that final statement. Valeria stood in the hallway, the quietness of the inn pressing in around her, but her mind was anything but silent. Lucavian's words echoed relentlessly. Bending the rules for the path you believe in isn't wrong. She had never thought in those terms before. Her entire life, she had been taught that rules were the foundation of society. The Olarian family, a family of knights, was built on principles of discipline, honor, and duty. Abiding by the rules was what separated a knight from a common fighter. She had been told time and time again that without rules, without structure, there would be chaos. And for someone in her position, the stakes were even higher. She wasn't just a knight. She was the heir to a noble house. Her actions reflected on her family, and every decision she made had consequences. But what if the rules were the problem? The thought startled her. If she adhered strictly to the rules, she would take her knights to the tournament. They would accompany her, guarding her every step, ensuring her safety. And yet, wasn't that the very thing that was holding her back? How could she prove herself? How could she become the knight she was meant to be if she always had a safety net? The more she thought about it, the more she realized that Lucavian's point, though unconventional, wasn't entirely wrong. Following the rules had kept her on the path her family expected, but it also left her in this frustrating position. Her hands were tied by her duty, her actions dictated by what was expected of her. But if I were to bend the rules, just this once, the idea was intoxicating. To face the challenge alone, without her knights, without the safety net of her family name. To prove that she was more than just the heir of House Olarian. She would be free to make her own decisions, to fight on her terms. Yet, the other side of her training, the rigid, disciplined side, fought back. If she defied her father's orders, even in something as small as leaving her knights behind, she would be going against everything she had been taught. Wouldn't that be a betrayal of her family's trust? But at the same time, she was trapped. The rules she had always followed, the very principles that were supposed to guide her, had become a cage. She could see no other way out of her dilemma unless she made a choice. Either she followed the rules, took her knights, and played the part of the dutiful daughter, or she defied those rules, left them behind, and took her own path, even if it meant bending her father's orders. Her breath came a little quicker, the weight of the decision settling heavily on her shoulders. What kind of knight do I want to be? The question gnawed at her. Would she continue being the knight her family had molded? Or would she take this chance to be something more, something of her own making? Valeria closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to calm the storm raging inside her. At the end of it all, she knew one thing with certainty. A decision had to be made. Whether it was by the rules or against them, she couldn't remain paralyzed by indecision. The tournament at Andelheim was her opportunity, and she would have to choose how to face it. Follow the rules and stay protected, or bend them and take the risk. Just as Valeria's thoughts began to swirl, her focus narrowing on the weight of the decision she faced, a familiar voice pulled her back to reality. "Lady Valeria, did you finish your morning training?" It was Sir Elthan, one of her most trusted knights. His presence was always steady, reliable, a rock amid whatever chaos surrounded her. He stood a few paces away, his posture as respectful as ever, though his eyes carried a hint of concern. He had always been perceptive when it came to her moods. Valeria blinked, pushing away the lingering thoughts of her dilemma. She had been so lost in her mind that she hadn't even heard him approach. Forcing herself to appear composed, she turned to face him. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady but curt. "Just finished." Elthan nodded, though his eyes seemed to linger on her a bit longer than usual. It was as if he sensed that something was troubling her, but he didn't press. He never did unless necessary. "You were up early, my lady," he remarked, his tone casual but polite. "I assume you've had time to reflect on our next course of action?" Valeria's jaw tightened ever so slightly. Reflect? That was an understatement. She had been doing nothing but reflecting since yesterday. She glanced at Elfin, his unwavering loyalty clear in every gesture. The knight would follow her anywhere, no questions asked. But that was part of the problem. Would he understand if she left him and the others behind? Her mind raced for a moment, but she quickly reined it in. This wasn't the time for hesitation. She had to maintain control of the situation, even if the answer wasn't yet fully clear to her. "I've been thinking," she began, careful with her words. "We'll stay here for a few more days as planned to rest. After that, we'll decide our next move." She kept her tone neutral, non-committal. She needed more time to figure out how she would navigate this decision. Elfin nodded, his expression calm. "Understood, Lady Valeria. The men will be ready for whatever you decide." Valeria gave a small nod of acknowledgement, though her thoughts were still far from settled. As Elfin turned to leave, she found herself clenching her fists again, the weight of the choice looming larger than ever. Would they understand? That was the question that wouldn't leave her alone. Elfin paused for a moment as if sensing her inner turmoil. "If there's anything troubling you, my lady," he said softly, "you know you can always confide in us." Valeria's heart clenched for a moment, but she forced a smile, though it felt hollow. "Thank you, Elfin. I'll keep that in mind." As the knight bowed and took his leave, Valeria stood there in the quiet hallway, feeling as if she were once again standing at the edge of a precipice. Yet little by little, something slowly started spreading in her heart. A seed of change on her worldview, something that would normally bother her in the future countless times. That stone-like Valeria Olarian. She slowly started changing. I led the horse out of the stable, its coat gleaming in the morning sun. The coper had tried every trick in the book to raise the price, spouting off about lineage, strength, and stamina, but I had no patience for his games. In the end, I left him with a purse lighter than I would have liked, but a horse was necessary. I wouldn't be walking the rest of the way. Vitaliera stretched lazily on my shoulder, her white tail flicking with mild interest. "You sure know how to handle those types." The look on his face when you cut the price in half. Priceless. I didn't respond immediately, focusing on checking the saddle one more time. The horse was sturdy, at least, and it would get me where I needed to go. I mounted the horse, adjusting my cloak as I prepared to leave Rackenshaw behind. The town had served its purpose, and there was nothing more for me here. The sword created by Harlan rested securely in its sheath at my side. I could still feel the weight of it, an unfamiliar yet welcome presence. "Now that you've got your shiny new sword, what exactly are you planning to do with it?" Vitaliara's voice cut through the quiet, her curiosity barely masked. I smirked. "I'm going to eat a fish." Chapter 150, on the other page. Fush. Heavy rain continued to fall down, drenching the lands. Tap, tap, tap. Under the relentless downpour, a small figure trudged forward, their steps barely audible against the pounding rain. The person's body, slight and delicate, appeared almost childlike in stature. Their hood, soaked through and heavy with water, clung to their head, offering little protection now. Droplets streamed down their face, tracing invisible lines beneath the fabric. The figure's movements were slow and purposeful, each step a fight against the weight of the storm. The road ahead was blurred by the rain, a muddled pathway of glistening puddles and slick mud. Despite the harshness of the weather, the figure pressed on, determined, as if the storm was merely an inconvenience. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the surroundings for a brief moment. In that fleeting light, the figure's small frame became clear, but their face remained obscured, hidden beneath the shadow of the drenched hood. Their hands, pale and fragile, clutched something close to their chest, wrapped in cloth to keep it dry. Fush! Heavy rain continued to fall. Tap, tap, tap. The small figure moved forward with the same unwavering determination. Suddenly, a voice cut through the sound of the storm, sharp and commanding. "What are you waiting for? Move!" The figure halted briefly but didn't turn to face the voice. Their head remained lowered, rainwater trickling down their hood and into their soaked clothes. The voice belonged to a man, stern and impatient. His figure loomed behind them, tall and broad, a shadow in the rain. "You are going to complete the training." His tone was heavy with authority, though there was a strange coldness underneath. "Look, your sister has already finished it." The words hung in the air, laden with expectation. The figure's small body stiffened at the mention of their sister. They didn't respond immediately but shifted their grip on the bundle in their arms, clutching it tighter. The man's gaze sharpened as he took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "Don't disappoint me," he added, his voice low, almost a growl. His piercing eyes then flicked away from the child and, strangely, met her eyes. "TSSK." A sharp click of the tongue broke the silence within the carriage. The girl with long, clear black hair cascading down to her waist stared out of the window, watching as the rain flowed in rivulets down the glass. The heavy downpour mirrored the memory that had resurfaced in her mind, unwelcome and unpleasant. "What an unpleasant memory again," she muttered softly to herself, her voice carrying a hint of bitterness. Beside her, the maid, who had been sitting quietly until now, sensed the shift in her mood. Her gaze turned towards her lady, concern evident in her eyes. "My lady," the maid asked gently, her voice careful not to intrude too much, "did something happen?" The girl didn't respond immediately. Her dark eyes remained fixed on the rainy landscape outside, her fingers idly brushing the folds of her dress. The rhythmic sound of the rain against the carriage roof filled the air, but inside, the tension was palpable. After a moment, the girl finally turned her gaze towards her maid, her expression cold yet with a subtle undercurrent of something deeper, perhaps anger, perhaps pain. "It's nothing," she replied. "Just remembered some unpleasant memories." The girl turned her attention back to the window, her eyes tracing the lines of rain streaming down the glass. The sound of the carriage wheels splashing through puddles filled the silence for a moment. The maid, sensing the conversation wasn't quite over, kept her tone soft and reassuring. "It won't take much longer to reach Rackenshaw, my lady," she said, her eyes filled with quiet concern. She glanced at her young mistress, gauging her reaction before continuing. "But, are you certain about this? It may just be a coincidence." The girl's fingers stilled on the folds of her dress, her jaw tightening slightly. Her eyes remained on the rainy landscape, though her mind was clearly elsewhere. After a pause, she slowly shook her head, a quiet but resolute gesture. "There is no way it's a coincidence," she replied, her voice calm but filled with certainty. "That name, it's unique." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with significance. The maid nodded, though the concern in her eyes deepened. She knew better than to push further. Whatever lay ahead for her lady, it wasn't something to be taken lightly. "The disgrace who put a stain on the name of our family. Do you think you can escape?" The girl muttered, her voice low but laced with a dangerous edge. As the words left her lips, a faint yellow glow began to pulse around her, flickering with intensity. The mana emanating from her body seemed to charge the very air, and the temperature inside the carriage rose steadily. Her maid's eyes widened, though she remained composed, accustomed to her lady's abilities. The girl's eyes burned with an inner fire, reflecting her rage and determination. Small flames flickered along the hem of her clothes, dancing across her sleeves, though they did not burn the fabric. The air crackled with heat as the mana swirled around her, growing more intense with each passing second. This wasn't something just anyone could do. The ability to materialize one's intent into the physical world required immense control and power, a skill only a 4-star awakened could possess. The flames were an extension of her will, a manifestation of the seething emotions that churned beneath her composed exterior. The maid, though concerned, did not move. She knew her lady's strength and understood that pushing her now would only stoke the flames further. "My lady, please, calm yourself," the maid whispered softly, her voice steady yet respectful. "The time will come soon enough." The girl exhaled sharply, her gaze still fixed on the outside, the flames dimming as she brought her emotions under control. The yellow glow slowly faded, and the oppressive heat in the carriage eased, leaving only a faint warmth lingering in the air. It's not about patience, the girl said, her voice returning to its usual cold tone. It's about restoring the lost honor of our family. As for how that happened, one must go 1/2 a year back. The heavy oak door slammed shut with a resounding thud, cutting off the echo of hurried footsteps. Inside the dimly lit room, a tall, stern man stood near the window, his cold, hard face illuminated by the flickering candlelight. His sharp, steel-gray eyes bore into the parchment in his hands. The ink smudged from where his grip tightened in fury. His jaw clenched, the silence thickened around him as the fire crackled in the hearth, unable to dispel the biting chill of his presence. His broad shoulders, clad in a crisp military coat, rose and fell with restrained fury, the veins in his neck pulsing with barely contained rage. Suddenly, the quiet shattered. He had deserted his post and escaped? The man's hand trembled as he read the words again, his fingers tightening around the parchment as though he could strangle the very letters off the page. His cold, steel-gray eyes flared with a fierce, murderous light as the insult sunk deeper into his veins. Escaped? That wretched bastard dared to escape? His voice rose into a snarl, the sound low and venomous, each word dripping with disgust. His broad shoulders squared, his military coat shifting with the rigid tension in his body. The Thorn family name, his name, stained by this worthless cur. The disgrace already hanging over their legacy like a festering wound was now deepened beyond repair. First, he dishonors us by assaulting the Duke's daughter, and now he flees from the battlefield like a coward. His voice erupted, the room seeming to shrink under the weight of his wrath. He slammed the letter onto the desk, the parchment crinkling under his fist, the veins in his neck pulsing visibly. The fire crackled louder in the hearth, almost in response to the rage in the room, but it did nothing to warm the icy fury radiating from him. Do you have any idea what this means? The humiliation, the shame? His eyes darted to the empty space in the room as if expecting a ghost of the past to answer. The Thorns will be a laughingstock, a disgrace. His teeth ground together audibly, the muscles in his jaw twitching from the effort of holding back the flood of curses that threatened to spill from his mouth. The name Thorn had once stood for something noble, proud, and unyielding. Now, because of him, it was whispered in hushed tones, mocked in back rooms, associated with scandal and cowardice. I sent him to that battlefield to bleed for his shame, to redeem the family name. His fist crashed down onto the desk again, this time sending the inkpot flying, black ink splattering across the wood in violent streaks. The stain spreading over the desk mirrored the dark shadow now cast over the Thorn family. Assaulting the Duke's daughter wasn't enough, was it? He spat, his voice filled with bitter venom. Now he defies me, escapes like a rat in the night, after I gave him the one chance to prove himself, to die with at least a shred of honor. The thunderous roar of the fire was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. The man's breath hitched, his cold eyes narrowing as his gaze snapped toward the heavy oak barrier. For a moment, silence stretched, save for the crackling flames and the muffled hiss of ink pooling across the desk. Enter, he barked, his voice still seething with the remnants of his fury. The door creaked open slowly, and in stepped a girl with clear black hair cascading down her back, her face shadowed but resolute. Her eyes, sharp as steel, met her father's without flinching. There was no hesitation, no fear, only a fierce determination that mirrored the storm brewing within him. She stepped forward with purpose, her footsteps light yet confident as they crossed the room. Father, she began, her voice steady, carrying an undercurrent of cold resolve. Leave that to me. The man's eyes, still alight with fury, flickered as they met hers. There was a long pause before he spoke, his voice cutting through the tense air. What are you saying? I will find him, she continued, her tone unwavering, as if the decision had already been made. And I will take his head myself,